Today I can confirm that at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September, Australia will recognise the State of Palestine. Australia will recognise the right of the Palestinian people to a state of their own, predicated on the commitments Australia has received from the Palestinian Authority. We will work with the international community to make this right a reality. Australia is making this statement today following our Cabinet meeting as part of a coordinated global effort building momentum for a two-state solution. Over the past fortnight, I have discussed this with Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, Prime Minister Luxon and Prime Minister Ishaba, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu last Thursday and President Abbas last Tuesday. A two-state solution is humanity's best hope to break the cycle of violence in the Middle East and to bring an end to the conflict, suffering and starvation in Gaza. The international community's vision for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East always encompassed two states living side by side with internationally recognised borders, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, with security for the people of both nations. This is the plan Australia was the first member of the United Nations to vote for back in 1947, when we proudly supported the creation of the modern State of Israel as a state for the Jewish people alongside a state for the Palestinian people. And that is why, when we recognise the long-held and legitimate aspirations of the people of Palestine, we are also upholding and strengthening our commitment to the people of Israel and their right to live in freedom, security and safety. Because until Israeli and Palestinian statehood is permanent, peace can only be temporary. Ever since the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, Australia has stood with the people of Israel and our partners and allies around the world in calling for the release of the hostages. For the sake of their loved ones and all who share in their pain, we repeat that call today. Our government has made it clear that there can be no role for the terrorists of Hamas in any future Palestinian state. This is one of the commitments Australia has sought and received from President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has reaffirmed it recognises Israel's right to exist in peace and security. It has committed to demilitarise and to hold general elections. It has pledged to abolish the system of payments to the families of prisoners and martyrs, and promised broader reform of governance, financial transparency in the education system, including international oversight to guard against the incitement of violence and hatred. These detailed and significant commitments have been given even greater weight by the Arab League's unprecedented demand for Hamas to end its rule in Gaza and surrender its weapons to the Palestinian Authority. This is an opportunity to deliver self-determination for the people of Palestine in a way that isolates Hamas, disarms it and drives it out of the region once and for all. The international community is moving to establish a Palestinian state, and it is opposing actions which undermine the two-state solution. The Netanyahu government is rapidly expanding illegal settlements. Settler violence in the West Bank has increased. There have been threats to annex the occupied Palestinian territories and proposing the permanent forced displacement of the Palestinian people. These actions, together with the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, risk putting a two-state solution out of reach for a generation. I've said it publicly and I said it directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The situation in Gaza has gone beyond the world's worst fears. Far too many innocent lives have been lost. The Israeli government continues to defy international law and deny sufficient aid, food and water to desperate people, including children. This vital aid must be allowed to get to the people who need it most. This is about much more than drawing a line on a map. This is about delivering a lifeline to the people of Gaza. I understand that on this issue, history casts a long shadow. Every generation has known failures and false dawns. Yet the story of this struggle is also one of opportunities not taken. That is where the risk of trying is nothing compared to the danger of letting this moment pass us by. The toll of the status quo is growing by the day, and it can be measured in innocent lives. The world cannot wait for success to be guaranteed. That only means waiting for a day that will never come. There is a moment of opportunity here, and Australia will work with the international community to seize it. I invite Minister Wong to make some remarks and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, it's been more than 77 years since the world promised a Palestinian state, knowing that there cannot be lasting peace for both peoples without a two-state solution. And in the nearly 2 years since October 7, we have been working with the international community on breaking the cycle of violence that the Middle East has known for generations. Across the world, nations have agreed that we cannot keep doing the same thing and hoping for a different outcome. We can't keep waiting for the end of a peace process that has ground to a halt. So last April, our government started a conversation with the Australian people about changing Australia's approach. We made clear we would recognise Palestine when it would best contribute momentum to peace. September is that time. When the world says this has gone on far too long. When the world says the heartbreak, death and destruction must end. The world watched in horror the attacks by Hamas on October 7, the worst loss of Jewish lives on a single day since the Holocaust. Hostages are still cruelly held, and we want them all released and reunited with their families and loved ones. And the world has watched in horror since, as tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians are killed, thousands starving, the faces of children we cannot forget. Australians, people around the world, have been haunted by these images. We have always said that Palestinian civilians cannot be made to pay the price of defeating Hamas. But a whole population has been shattered. So this September, the international community has the chance to forge hope from despair as the world seizes the opportunities that are presented by the new commitments of the Palestinian Authority, and as the world seeks to support the Arab League's efforts to isolate Hamas. The Netanyahu government has ignored international opposition to its conduct of the war in Gaza. It's ignored international opposition to rapidly expanding illegal settlements that are extinguishing the prospect of two-state solution. And we know that two states is the key. It is the key to a just peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. We also know this is not the end. It is just the beginning. There is much more work to do in building the Palestinian state. We will help build the capacity of the Palestinian Authority, and with the international community, Australia will hold the Palestinian Authority to its commitments. The practical implementation of our recognition will be tied to progress on these commitments. We will continue to provide humanitarian aid with our partners to try and help vulnerable civilians to get basic supplies they need, and we will work with partners to build a pathway out of the cycle of violence to a peace that is enduring and is just, with recognition of each other's right to exist, recognition by the countries of the region, two states, Israel and Palestine.
Andrew.
When you spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister, I imagine he argued that in recognising Palestinian statehood, it would be rewarding Hamas. He said that publicly. We've heard the same comment from Marco Rubio, and we've heard it from the coalition as well. What's your answer to that assertion?
Hamas don't support two states. Hamas support one state, in their words, from the river to the sea. Hamas do not support recognising the right of Israel to exist. This is an opportunity to isolate Hamas that has been forged by the very clear statements of the Palestinian Authority on June 10 and the very clear statements of the Arab League. Paul?
Prime Minister, just on that call with the Israeli leader, did he warn you against this? Can you give us an explanation of the tone of that call? And just on the PA, just briefly, you mentioned a bunch of conditions that you say you've secured. How much of them were briefed to you by Mahmoud Abbas versus his assurances given to the French president? Are any of them new conditions briefed to you in the call last week?
Well, they were. It wasn't just a call, there was follow-up to that. And the conditions are ones that are consistent with the declaration in June, that recognition of the State of Israel, which of course the Palestinian Authority would argue had occurred with the Oslo Accords, but also, I think, new and important statements. Demilitarisation of any future Palestinian state, the potential role for international forces in security, the reform of governance, including of education, as well as a call for elections, the isolation and opposition to Hamas playing any role in a future Palestinian state. The discussion that I had with Prime Minister Netanyahu was one which was a civil discussion, and I thank him for the conversation that we had. It was a long discussion in the context of leaders' discussions can often be pretty brief, but we had an opportunity. I was able to say that the arguments that he put to me were very similar to the arguments that he put more than a year ago. It seems to me very clearly, and I put the argument to him, that we need a political solution, not a military one, because a military response alone has seen the devastation in Gaza, and that has contributed to the massive concern that we see from the international community, not just from leaders, but from community members, at the catastrophe that we are witnessing in Gaza. Katina?
Benjamin Netanyahu said overnight that just recognising a state of Palestine isn't going to bring peace. Did he make that point to you as well during your call, and what do you say to that? And Senator Wong, did you tell Marco Rubio in your call overnight about this move that Australia would make today?
Prime Minister Netanyahu put arguments to me that consistent with what he has made internationally as well, publicly. I put arguments which are consistent with what I have said publicly over a long period of time as well.
Yes, I spoke to Secretary Rubio ahead of the announcement, and as a matter of diplomatic courtesy advised him of our intention to announce.
Yep.
For the Senator, on the Rubio phone call, did you get any assurances that our decision on this will not affect the rest of the bilateral relationship with the US, given the Trump administration's opposition? You're not expecting any blowback on things like trade or AUKUS or anything else?
We speak for Australia and we make our sovereign decisions, but you will see from the readout, I think, that the State Department have issued since the call. We spoke about a range of matters, including the Indo-Pacific and security in the Indo-Pacific, and I think you can discern from that that the project that we are engaged in with the United States and others, which is peace, stability and security in our region, is something we both remain very committed to.
We'll go 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go over that side.
Prime Minister,
Just on the conditionality that you've expressed with the Palestinian Authority, can you just clarify or explain where you're at on the release of the hostages and ceasefire itself?
Well, we want to see the hostages released. We want to see the hostages never taken. I mean, my heart goes out to the families of those who are impacted by this. We want to see as well an immediate ceasefire. I think Australians want two things. I've said this before very clearly. They want the killing to stop. They want peace and security in the Middle East. They know this is a complex issue, but they also know that the violence has gone on for far too long. And the second thing they want is that they do not want conflict brought here to Australia. They want a harmonious community, which is what we have. Yep, here. Yep.
Prime Minister, can I ask you, the everyday Australian watching on here, is this a symbolic gesture? Are we expecting the US to veto this at the Security Council at the UN? What would your argument be to Australians who think this is symbolic?
This is a practical contribution towards building momentum. This is not Australia acting alone. What we are seeing is a range of countries engaging in detailed dialogue as well, behind the scenes, if you like, talking about what a peace looks like in the region. And it's something that hasn't had an impact on the world. This conflict, which has gone on for such a long period of time, I think Australians want to see an end to it. And an end to it can only be secured when both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security.
Thank you. Speaking of practicalities, does Australia intend to open an embassy in the West Bank, for example, and will Australia or will Australia credit our ambassador in Israel to Palestine? And further, will we convert the general delegation of Palestine to a full embassy status?
First, in response to that, as I said in my opening statement, is that we will tie the various practical steps towards recognition, you referenced some, not all, to the Palestinian Authority's commitments and the ensuring that those indeed take place and the other actions of the international community. Can I just make this point in response to an earlier question? You know, we have an opportunity as a nation to contribute to momentum towards two states, and that is the only prospect for peace.
Anna.
There have been concerns raised, and perhaps you share them, that since the UK, Canada and France made their announcements, that it's only emboldened the Netanyahu government in its actions. Do you have any concerns that making these announcements now is actually worse for civilians in the short term, given that the Netanyahu government seems committed to continue regardless of what the international community's message is? And Senator Wong, just after your phone call, what do you say to those who think the potential for statehood to be meaningful will only really work if the US was to also take that step?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu foreshadowed the announcements that have been made over the last couple of days as well. I, of course, expressed my concern with such a direction that the Netanyahu government was determined to go in. And certainly I think that, I expressed it in a very clear way, but the Prime Minister's comments were similar to what he had made a year ago, which is that they were determined to remove Hamas. I, of course, indicated our complete abhorrence of the existence of Hamas and our complete opposition to Hamas as a terrorist organisation having any future role in a Palestinian state.
Well, the US obviously has a unique role in the world, and we support President Trump's work to attain a ceasefire for hostage release and for humanitarian relief. Australia has an opportunity now, as I've said, to contribute to the momentum towards two states, which is the way in which the cycle of violence can be broken. In relation to ceasefire on the ground, I would make the point that the Israeli Security Cabinet's decision to launch a large-scale offensive into Gaza is counter to the prospect of a ceasefire.
Yep. I'll just take a few more.
Prime Minister, you've often spoke about the importance of general elections as a condition for recognition. I guess given the state of Gaza at the moment, I think many people would question whether they're in a position to hold elections. Given your conversations with other world leaders, when would you like to see sort of that happen? And any of the details? I'd
like to see it happen as soon as possible, but we are in. That is one of the issues that will be debated going forward. It's a part of the reform of the Palestinian Authority, which is required. The PA have not had an election for some time, and when Hamas took over Gaza, of course, there was violence by Hamas against Palestinians as well. I do want to make this point. Hamas is not just an enemy of Israelis, it's an enemy of the Palestinian people as well. And their actions, including during the current conflict, where opposition to Hamas has been met with brutality, is recognised by not just by Australia but by the international community. Anna?
Could I just get you to expand a bit on the practical measures? Firstly, if there isn't progress in the conditions, is there any situation in which Australia would revoke its recognition? And on the actual practical measures themselves, would we be looking to move with, say, the UK and France on things like borders, a capital, sea rights, those kinds of issues?
Those are all matters we would want to work with the international community on, and I think I can safely say that, given how much we've engaged with some of the countries that you referenced, that we are of very similar mind in terms of ensuring that there is progress on the commitments that you've outlined.
Phil, to bring it home.
Just on, there's no situation in which we would revoke that recognition now that it's been...
Our expectation is the international community will work with all parties to ensure not only that those commitments are adhered to, but there is progress towards two states. Again, I repeat, there is no sustained peace unless we see a two-state solution. I think we all know that.
Sorry, Pam, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but the whole effort to get the Palestinians to decouple from Hamas is obviously going to require cooperation from Tehran. I mean, Hamas won power in a general election in 2006 on the back of disgruntlement over the Iraq war. They're firmly entrenched there. Are we being a bit simplistic to say there's that's inseparable down there? I mean, how do you pressure Iran to play its role in this, to back off in that region?
Not at all. I think that one of the key moments, if you like, when people will look at how we've got to where we are today, will be not just June 10, the statement by the Palestinian Authority, but importantly the statement by Arab nations, which was very historic. The meeting convened by France and Saudi Arabia in New York produced very clear and unequivocal statements of opposition to Hamas, of disarming of Hamas, and of Hamas not playing a future role. Thanks very much.
And there we have it, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese side by side with Foreign Minister Penny Wong announcing that Australia will recognise Palestinian statehood at the United Nations General Assembly in September. This is an historic shift for Australia, and you can hear from the Prime Minister's language there that he really feels the sense of history, the weight of history. In his words, it's a lifeline, he says, to the people of Gaza. History casts a long shadow. Generations have known failures and false starts in the Middle East. He says this is a story of opportunities not taken, and then proceeded to say that is where the risk of trying is nothing compared to the danger of letting this moment pass us by. So Anthony Albanese genuinely believes that this is a moment for the world, for Western nations to combine to add momentum towards a push for Palestinian statehood. There are conditions attached, the first of which is that there should be no role for Hamas in a future Palestinian state. He says that he's spoken to the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who has given given that commitment. And the second is for the Palestinian Authority itself to demilitarise and democratise, basically, to hold elections next year in what would be the first elections in 20 years. Now, it's a big moment. I'm joined in the studio by our political reporter, Olivia Casely. And Liv, the Prime Minister was asked there by journalists, we knew this was a matter of when, not if. Today is clearly the day.
Yeah.
Tell us about the round of diplomacy that's been going on behind the scenes over the past sort of 48 hours and into late last week.
Well, it's been a flurry of diplomatic activity behind the scenes, and I think while we knew that this was the sort of lane of traffic that we were moving in, we probably didn't expect it to happen as soon as now. We did sort of expect that perhaps there could be an announcement going into the United Nations General Assembly meeting next month. But interestingly, we heard there from Anthony Albanese. He's spoken in the past week with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli president. We didn't know that, and that was last Thursday. And this is really critical in the broader context. He's spoken to the leader of the Palestinian Authority, as you mentioned before as well, where he sought a certain, commitments in terms of, garnering Australia's support. But two, he met with the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jeremy Luxon, over the weekend. They no doubt discussed this question of Palestinian statehood, given just moments before this press conference too, we did hear that New Zealand's moving in this direction as well. But a lot of discussions behind the scenes. It has been a complicated issue, I guess, for the government more generally, but it's been really brought to a head to the escalating humanitarian crisis on the ground in Gaza.
So we are clearly joining a coordinated international effort here, and the aim of that is to bring about peace. We know from Israel's comments, from Benjamin Netanyahu's comments, he is not pursuing a two-state solution. And so we are seeing Western nations use the leverage they can to basically to force Israel's hand on this and recognise Palestinian Authority. But the conditions that we've imposed, I'm keen to sort of tease that out. What is the Prime Minister telling us? Because we're taking a bit of a leap here, Australia, in taking the Palestinian Authority at its word that certain things will happen before statehood is actually recognised.
I guess that speaks to just the crisis on the ground in Gaza, that the government is willing to have those discussions with the Palestinian Authority and seek those commitments and try and move forward on that basis. Because ultimately, we've heard these commitments before, these requests, if you like. So, for example, that Hamas plays no role in any future Palestinian government. That's super significant, and we've heard similar requests from some of our other Western allies. But fascinatingly, we also heard from the Arab League nations just, I think it must have been last week now too, saying that they agree that that should also be a condition of support for Palestinian statehood. We also heard from the PM there speaking about the demilitarisation of Hamas. And then we also heard too, he didn't in the first instance mention the release of hostages. However, he later clarified that that's something that of course he wants to see. And really, he's framing this within the broader context of wanting peace in the region more generally. I thought it was interesting too to hear from Foreign Minister Penny Wong on the practical steps, what it would look like if or when Palestinian statehood does occur, that question, that when it comes to, say, a Palestinian embassy, she says that ultimately she wants to see some of those conditions actually met. So there are clear red lines for the government. It is conditional, but it's clear this is the direction we're moving.
And we know that the Prime Minister clearly believes that he has largely this, he's moving in lockstep with the sentiment of the Australian public. And we saw really a massive protest over the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of Palestinian statehood and much more than that, Palestinian sovereignty and rights. How has the Prime Minister managed the internal politics of this? It's always been a trickier issue for Labor because there's a big grassroots support for recognising Palestinian statehood, but then the parliamentary team hasn't always sort of stood shoulder to shoulder in that respect.
I think it's been an enormous challenge for him and as well as Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and they have tried to walk this diplomatic tightrope, if you like, even on the domestic sense as well, trying to, speak to those in the party that are staunch supporters of Palestinian statehood, but those too who support Israel's right to exist. And we've seen these tensions play out, especially over the first term of the Albanese government. We've seen Ed Husic, a former industry minister and science minister, now a backbencher, repeatedly calling on the government to do more in this space and be more forceful in its condemnation of Israel. And let's not forget, former senator, or Labor senator, I should say, Fatima Payman, left the party. That is, she left Labor in July of last year over this very issue. She wasn't happy with how it indicated. So it has been a problem for them, and it's certainly, I think, perhaps this will help those negotiations moving forward.
Well, just to bring our audience up to speed, it was about a year ago when Foreign Minister Penny Wong first signalled a bit of a shift in Australia's position. There's a long-standing bipartisan position for a negotiated two-state solution between Israel, between a future Palestinian state. But about a year ago, in the midst of this Gaza war, Penny Wong said that she no longer believed Palestinian statehood had to come at the end of that process, but rather could be at the almost start of that process as a pathway towards peace. But it's really in the past 3 weeks where we've seen rapid global movements. And so for our audience, here's a look back at just the last 3 weeks on this issue of Palestinian statehood.
We won't do any decision as a gesture. We will do it as a way forward if the circumstances are met. Is the time right now? Are we about to imminently do that? No, we are not.
But at the General Assembly?
Are we about to do that? No, we are not. But we will engage constructively.
We welcome other comments by the countries of the Arab League condemning Hamas.
The UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza.
Canada intends to recognise the State of Palestine.
That's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that.
There is no starvation in Gaza.
There's hunger and starvation in Gaza, and it needs to be addressed.
The talks with Hamas fell apart on the day Macron made the unilateral decision that he's going to recognize a Palestinian state. And then you have other people come forward, other countries say, well, if there's not a ceasefire by September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Well, if I'm Hamas, I basically conclude, let's not do a ceasefire, because we can be rewarded.
To have European countries and Australia march into that rabbit hole, it's actually shameful.
Sometimes out of a crisis comes a moment of opportunity.
Australian recognition of a state of Palestine is a matter of when, not if.
We won't be driven by a time frame. What we'll be driven by is when the recognition of Palestine can make a contribution to the creation of two states.
We are Palestinians!
I think this is a moment, sort of wake-up call for Australian politics.
I think the entire international community is distressed by what we're seeing happening in Gaza.
Does Israel have a moral responsibility? Yes. Should Israel be getting more aid in to civilians in Gaza? Absolutely. But let us not be blind, Andrew, to the reality. Any moral outrage is with the terrorists.
There have frequently been countries where part of that nation has been occupied by a terrorist group, and we haven't ceased to recognise the country.
It's a matter of when, not if.
And those last comments were from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Queenstown on Saturday. And now we know when. It is today. Today is the day that Australia has announced that it will be recognising Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly in September, joining allies France, Canada and the UK as the latest countries to recognise statehood. And it should be noted at this point that about 147 of the 193 member states of the UN already recognise Palestinian statehood. But what has shifted in the past last few weeks is bigger, wealthier Western powers like France and the UK moving towards this shift in policy. And to bring in our political reporter Olivia Casely again, we've been chatting about this really historic announcement being made today. And we heard in that montage, which was beautifully put together by our team here, Michaelia Cash, the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, she took a pretty, as we saw the government strengthening and hardening its language against Israel's actions in Gaza, we saw some kind of also interesting tensions within the coalition over, you know, the extent to which it is supporting Israel at all costs, its acknowledgement of whether there is starvation happening within Gaza. How has this kind of played out?
Well, I think it's really fascinating to see how we're now seeing, I guess, a divergence in opinion from within the coalition ranks. As we know, over the course of this conflict, the opposition generally has been staunch defenders of Israel's right to defend itself. They I guess, seized upon a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in Australia and really used that to turn the blowtorch on Anthony Albanese politically. However, in recent weeks, as we know, as the humanitarian crisis worsens on the ground, we have been seeing more and more Liberals, not just moderates, coming out in condemnation or indeed raising issues with the fact that that aid hasn't been getting in. So, for example, Dave Sharma, he used to be Australia's ambassador to Israel. He's a Liberal moderate. He raised concerns with this, saying that more needs to be done to ensure aid's getting in. We heard similar things from Liberal Senator James Paterson. Yes, Michaelia Cash, the Shadow Foreign Minister, was much more hardline in her response when she appeared on Sky News on Friday, but we've also seen the likes of Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie sort of questioning what is Israel's end game here. So I think this reflects a broader shift in sentiment we're seeing in the community, in politics, when it comes to just how long this conflict is going to drag on, and really just wanting to see an end of this conflict and peace.
And the coalition's made it pretty clear at this stage it does not support the government's moves in this respect. However, that was all speculation. Let's see what they come out with now. But it's yet another very divisive and tricky issue for new leader Susan Lee to navigate. Before we throw back to Sydney, though, I wanted to ask you about some more comments from the Prime Minister and more along the international reaction. Australia is doing this with the cover of Western allies, and clearly the government believes that September is the chance to take this leap. The Prime Minister, what did he tell us about his call with Benjamin Netanyahu, who overnight said that Australia and other Western nations were shamefully going down a rabbit hole with recognition?
Well, I wish I could be a fly on the wall for that conversation, because we don't have an enormous amount of detail about exactly what happened in that conversation, other than that this Australia's position was raised with his Israeli counterpart. But I think given the fact that we did see those comments overnight, our intrepid Middle Eastern correspondent Matthew Doran asking Benjamin Netanyahu directly for his response, not only to this international movement and I guess shifting sentiment against Israel, but also Australia's position too. And Benjamin Netanyahu directly called out Australia, saying that if an October 7 style attack had happened in Sydney or Melbourne, then Australia wouldn't be acting, or would be sort of perhaps following Israel's lead. So that was his contention.
Pretty emotive language as well, right? Putting it in an Australian context to try and sort of get Australian sentiment on his side.
Absolutely, and calling the Albanese government shameless in its support really for growing international calls. I do think it is interesting that, if anything, Benjamin Netanyahu has seemed more emboldened over the past week or so. Those extraordinary calls last week when he said that he was planning a military operation into Gaza. That's despite these enormous international pressure that's being heaped upon Israel at this point in time to stop the conflict.
And I think we've seen, certainly from the Australian government's perspective, that sense of urgency. It was only last week, even before this latest plan was announced by the Netanyahu government, Penny Wong was saying, if we don't move towards recognising Palestinian statehood soon, there may not be any territory to recognise. And so clearly there was a sense of urgency there. But just finally, Liv, the United States here is crucial. Donald Trump is possibly the only man in the world who has much sway, much leverage with Benjamin Netanyahu in terms of trying to bring a ceasefire together. But the Trump administration does not support these moves to recognise Palestinian statehood, is there a risk here that in moving with France and the UK and Canada, Australia might be punished by the Trump administration via trade or another mechanism?
Look, I think at the end of the day, Australia has to stand by its own sovereignty and make its own decisions. I think what's interesting is that we have seen a shift in rhetoric from US President Donald Trump generally when it comes to Israel. He has actually disputed claims by Benjamin Netanyahu that there isn't starvation happening on the ground, that kind of thing. Yes, I'm sure it will be raised when Anthony Albanese finally gets that meeting, perhaps in the Oval Office, but with Donald Trump more generally. However, I do think that trade issues and shoring up AUKUS more generally will be more important areas of discussion to be discussing with Washington, but I'm sure that it will be a topic of conversation.
At least noted. Olivia Casely, thank you for your time for now. And throwing back to Sydney now, there's going to be a whole lot of reacts, both politically and in the community, and in fact internationally, to this, well, to Australia's decision really to add its weight behind this monumental shift in Middle East diplomacy. But that's where we'll leave it for now from Parliament House.
Jane Norman, thank you. And we will stay across this story with analysis throughout the afternoon, bringing in our Global Affairs editor, Laura Tingle. Before that announcement, Laura, you and I were speaking about the possible conditions that the Prime Minister might have attached to this announcement. He didn't necessarily announce conditions, but commitments. He said that he had sought commitments from the Palestinian President Abbas and the authority, and they range between demilitarisation, no role for Hamas, education, holding general elections, essentially. What is the difference between conditions and commitments?
It was really interesting, wasn't it? I think, he's gone in very hard by saying, we are going to recognise the state of Palestine, but he said that that's on the basis of these understandings that the Palestinian Authority have made these commitments. Clearly, I think we're at this sort of stage where the Palestinian Authority is such a diminished body. What the Prime Minister is saying is that the international community is basically going to go in, prop it up, sort of possibly almost be demanding to run it, if you like. It will be, there are these commitments that it will be expecting, but it will be going in there, making it a credible organisation based on these commitments from the body. I think the other really interesting aspect of this is, that both he and Penny Wong keep talking about the role of the Arab League in this. And I think if you go back to that declaration in New York a few weeks ago, which we've discussed previously, it is really significant, this big change that all the major Arab countries are now basically isolating Hamas and as a result, sort of leaving the way clear for the Palestinian Authority to potentially become, the vehicle of government for a new state of Palestine. Now, as the Foreign Minister said, this isn't the end, this is the beginning. And essentially the international community is quite clearly, in all its communications with the PA, made clear that, they have a plan and a view about where this should go, and that their support will be incumbent on that. It's not a question that they'll withdraw their support, but the extent of the support, the extent of the aid, the extent of the pressure that they're continuing to put on Israel in terms of, saying, Israel is breaking international law, Israel is committing war crimes, all those sorts of issues, they will be dependent on, the extent of that commitment will be dependent on how the PA responds.
So that is, in a perfect world, re-establishing or bolstering the PA with those international support there. If that indeed doesn't happen, then how tenuous is this announcement? And with respect to potential revocation of, Palestinian statehood recognition?
I think it's pretty hard to revoke the recognition of a state, but I mean, we're at a stage where, as people keep saying, look, what's going to be left to recognise if this doesn't happen? I mean, the West Bank settlements, the physical demolition of Gaza, let alone the absolutely, appalling human suffering that's going on in Gaza as we speak, means I think the international community, given we've had 70 years of saying both states have a right to exist, they need to act. They feel that they need to act now. to make sure that there's any prospect of that surviving. And I mean, that's how tenuous it is, I think, and where it goes from there is still, it's a long way down the track.
Australia today, New Zealand as well, come with their allies in Canada, UK. What does it mean with respect really to the global isolation, if you like, when you look at who's getting on board with this pathway towards recognition? What does it mean for the United States, who is remaining steadfast in their opposition to this?
Look, I don't think it's likely that the US is going to change its position on statehood anytime soon, just given how hard they are. But, you do see President Trump, there was reports on, I think, Friday night that he'd actually had a shouting match with Prime Minister Netanyahu over starvation. I think the pressure for the US to do things other than statehood, whether it's withholding aid, sanctions, pressuring Israel to do something serious about aid. I think those things are all still on the table. If you have this event in New York, in the president's hometown, where you've got, hundreds, well, not hundreds, but the majority of countries saying, we are recognising Palestine. And that essentially the US is isolated as the only permanent member of the Security Council that won't do that. I think they're going to have to do something to appease world opinion to show that they are trying to get Israel to behave better than it has been.
I was interested in the Prime Minister's response to when he was asked whether or not this was just symbolic or what would happen on the ground as a result. And his response was, it's a practical contribution that's building momentum. Do you see this as more symbolic than practical, or how do you view the announcement?
Well, at one level it clearly is symbolic, but it is nonetheless a very important political move, and I think it does just restate a really basic idea, which is the Palestinian people and the Palestinian state have a right to exist and to be to self-determination. A really basic idea of international law and the United Nations, and I think that starts the process of just saying, well, if we recognise the state, whatever the governance mechanism of that is, it starts to put responsibilities on the rest of the international community to protect that state and its interests, and to more assertively intervene in that state when it's being, treated as it currently is by Israel. So yes, it's very symbolic. Yes, it won't change things on the ground immediately, but there aren't all that many levers open to the international community to produce change here. So they've got to use whatever they've got, and I think the capacity to actually use this as a way of asserting not just Palestine's right to exist, but asserting the international community's interests in Palestine is going to be historically important.
And the mechanics of getting us there once it happens and it goes forward, that's very complex as well. The Foreign Minister was asked about that, perhaps ambassadorial roles where consulates would be held, etc. It's an extremely complex process.
It is a very complex process, and those are sort of the obvious parts of it. But if you're some person in Gaza who's moved for the 10th time and living in a tent or under a piece of plastic, you're not all that concerned about embassies, but you are concerned about the sense that the international community is looking for ways to intervene, maybe more aggressive in its, in its support for international aid organisations getting into Gaza. Those are the things that are really, I think, going to be very important, and how the international community works at that, I think, is very, significant. And I think there has been a lot of work going on behind the scenes about how you actually achieve something.
It would seem so. The Prime Minister outlined those many conversations that have been had over the past fortnight or so. Laura Tingle, many thanks to you. Let's have a look now at what the Middle East reaction might be and head to Middle East correspondent Alison Horn. And Ali, how will this likely be received in the Middle East, despite it being perhaps thought it was coming, but the reaction in both Israel as well as Gaza?
Well, I think in Gaza there'll be a sense of hope. They know that Palestinian statehood recognition won't necessarily change the immediate reality there. It's not going to stop the war in Gaza. It's not going to mean that their immediate living conditions or the humanitarian catastrophe there is going to be improved or eased in any way. But it will provide them with some sense of hope that the rest of the world sees what is happening inside Gaza, sees the catastrophic humanitarian conditions there, the starvation of children, the displacement of 2 million or, nearly 2 million Palestinians, sometimes multiple times, the wide and vast spread destruction of buildings and civilian infrastructure there. And they will feel that there is now growing global support for this war to end. I have reported from Gaza several times. I have many contacts there. They are just waking up now in the Middle East time, so this news will start to filter throughout the day. And I think that people there will have a renewed sense of hope that the world is paying attention to what is happening in Gaza. Almost daily, I receive messages from my contacts there asking, does the world care about Palestinians? Do they care about what is happening inside Gaza and happening inside the West Bank? I think today this will show some of those people that, yes, there is a growing sentiment amongst some of the biggest countries in the world, not necessarily Australia, but the United Kingdom, France, Canada. Australia's now followed suit. I think it's probably likely New Zealand will follow suit as well in the coming weeks. There'll be a sense among the Gazan population that the bigger players in the world are seeing their plight, not only the conditions in Gaza and wanting that to stop, but also the intention of giving them self-determination, the intention that they want a Palestinian state that can be governed by Palestinians, that can be free of Israeli occupation, which isn't the situation at the moment in either Gaza or the West Bank. So I think there'll be a lot of support within Gaza. But I also think that it will be tinged with a little bit of trepidation and even sadness, because there is, I guess, an unspoken reality in Gaza that only the United States really has the political capital to affect any impact on Israel's actions there. And although Benjamin Netanyahu would say that's not true, that Israel acts on its own, the United States definitely has a huge amount of sway. And, the word from Donald Trump does go a long way towards shaping Israel's actions inside Gaza. So I think it'll be met with mixed reaction inside the Palestinian territory. From the Israeli side, I think it'll also be mixed reaction. There is still an incredible amount of hurt and pain and anger over what happened on October 7 by Hamas, the murdering of civilians inside Israel, and the taking of hostages, 50 of whom still are being held inside Gaza. 20 of them are thought to be alive. And those kind of wounds are not quickly forgotten in Israel. They are deep and still very raw. This is still a continuation of the pain of October 7 every single day, according to people that I know there. And, I've lived there for the last 3 years or so, and people continually talk about this ongoing pain. And so there will be a sense there that by Australia promising to recognise Palestine, some people there will think that this is a reward for Hamas. They will believe that Hamas has committed these atrocities on October 7 and Israel has responded by trying to defend itself in what Israel says is this ongoing campaign inside Gaza. And there will be people inside Israel and Israeli citizens who just do not understand how Australia could be recognising a Palestinian state after what a militant Palestinian group has done to Israelis and has done to Jews. Now, that is not by far the only view across Israel. There are certainly a lot of pro-Palestinian activists there. There are a lot of peace activists inside Israel as well who would be welcoming this. But I also think that there would be a little bit of a different take there, because this idea of a two-state solution, it's kind of dead. to be blunt, it is not something that is openly talked about as a credible solution inside either Israel or the occupied West Bank or occupied Gaza. People there don't talk about peace in terms of a two-state solution. Israel's policy for a long time has been that a two-state solution cannot happen. Benjamin Netanyahu himself has previously said that he'd be happy to grant Palestinians autonomy, but not sovereignty. And that is a view that is shared by many Israelis because of historical security threats posed by militant groups, including Hamas, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, including groups that operate out of Jenin and Tulkarm in the West Bank, for example. Those security concerns are what people in Israel say is a major impediment to being able to have a credible two-state solution. So I think that you'll see a lot of mixed views within the Middle East. It'll be interesting to see as this chorus grows of countries that are going to recognise Palestinian statehood, what the reaction will be from other Arab nations, because undoubtedly there is going to need to be other Arab nations' support to bring the reality of a Palestinian state to light.
Alison, I'd also get your thoughts on the conditions or indeed the commitments that the Prime Minister sought from President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority with respect to this announcement. But for now, if you'll just stand by, so I want to take us to Parliament House where the Shadow Minister for Defence, Angus Taylor, has been speaking.
All Australians want to see the current chapter of tragedy in the Middle East come to an end as soon as possible. Began on October 7, 2023 with those tragic and brutal attacks by Hamas on Israel and Israelis. And I think Australians have had enough. They want to see it come to an end. But the preconditions necessary for a lasting peace are not in place. Those preconditions have been clear for a long time. Release of hostages, demilitarisation of Hamas, a commitment to peaceful coexistence and agreed borders. And these are preconditions that have been widely agreed across the world and certainly in Australia. Now, those preconditions are not in place and the government hasn't made the case that those preconditions have been met. Are they conditions that the government will take into account before deciding whether or not to proceed with this? It seems not, but they are questions for the government. What is very clear is we won't see a lasting peace without those preconditions being in place, and they are not in place right now. Happy to take questions.
The Prime Minister says that by recognising Palestinian statehood, Hamas would be isolated because they don't want a two-state solution. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say the risk here is the government is putting the cart before the horse. The risk here is the government is putting the cart before the horse. There's over a long period of time been agreement that preconditions that I've laid out are absolutely necessary before we see recognition of Palestine. And those preconditions are very reasonable. The release of hostages, the demilitarisation of Hamas, the recognition of Israel, agreement on borders. These are not new conditions, Probes, and this is why they are so essential. It seems to me the government is moving away from those being preconditions necessary for recognition of Palestine. And that is a big shift in the position of the government. Now, we all want to see this tragedy come to an end. We really do. I mean, it has been a tragic, tragic chapter that began on October 7, 2023. Tragic for Israel, tragic for the people of Gaza and the Palestinians. There's no doubt about that. But the preconditions necessary for a lasting peace have long been talked about and are still not in place.
But do you think the defenders of Israel are also frustrated by the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is talking about moving into Gaza, occupying it, taking the West Bank, the killing of 5 journos and cameramen just overnight? Does this speak of someone who does want to do a deal?
So the issue here that we're talking about is not the military strategy of Israel, it's the recognition of Palestine. That's the issue I'm focused on. And it's long been agreed that preconditions are necessary for that to be successful and to lead to a lasting peace. Those preconditions haven't been met. There are still hostages being held by I'll say that again. There are still hostages being held by Hamas. And it is clear there is not agreement on borders. It is clear there is not a recognition of Israel by Hamas. The preconditions are not met, and that is the crucial point here.
Do you agree with what the government says, that the way they're going about this by insisting that the Palestinian Authority should really be the ones governing this future state of Palestine? Do you agree that the way the government's going about this does isolate Hamas?
Well, that remains to be seen. That remains to be seen. What we know is Hamas has not been fully demilitarised. What we know is they don't recognise Israel. What we know is they haven't released hostages. And all of those are necessary preconditions for success here. We haven't seen those preconditions in place. And frankly, the risk here is this is rewarding terrorism. It's not getting to a lasting peace, which we all want to see. There's no doubt about the objective here.
But is it rewarding terrorism if the government insists Hamas can't be involved?
Well, you know what? I didn't hear the government's commitment today being conditional. I didn't hear that. I know there's things they want to achieve along the way, but I didn't hear it being conditional. And yet those preconditions haven't been met.
Well, they said the assurances had already been given. But can I ask you...
But by who?
Yeah.
By who?
By Mahmoud Abbas.
And does he have the authority to make sure those preconditions are all met? Is he able to ensure that hostages are released? Has he agreed, along with the Israelis, to borders? Is he able to ensure that Hamas is fully demilitarised? I don't think so. I don't think so. So the preconditions haven't been met.
Can I ask you, just in relation to comments by your colleague Andrew Hastie, do you agree that Israel has to unfold its end game?
Well, you know what? The discussion today is about the recognition of Palestine.
It's all linked with respect. I'm asking you about your colleague's comments. Do you think Israel has to come to the table and explain, particularly given you continue to show such great support for Israel, what its end game is?
No, my support is for a lasting peace in the Middle East. That's my support. My support is for the end of a tragedy which began on October 7, 2023, and I want to see that come to an end. I think all Australians want to see that come to an end. But we know there are preconditions necessary for the recognition of Palestine if we're going to have a lasting peace. And that's the focus of today. Any other questions?
Would it be reasonable for Australia not to follow the rest of the international community here?
Well, you know, what's reasonable is to focus on an outcome that is going to achieve lasting peace. And the preconditions necessary for that have not been met. The hostages haven't been released. Hamas has not been fully demilitarised. Hamas does not recognise the state of Israel. And we do not have any commitment to peaceful coexistence, and that is what we know is necessary for lasting peace. One more question.
Penny Wong flagged that she had given the heads up to Marco Rubio on this. Albanese is hoping that he secures a meeting with Donald Trump later this year. Could this impact the US relationship with Australia?
Well, you know what? On a separate point, the US relationship with Australia is unbelievably important to peace in our region, in the Indo-Pacific. We want to see the Prime Minister meet face-to-face with the President to ensure that that alliance is strong into the future. That is a top priority. We want to see it happen as soon as possible. We want to see a commitment to defence spending getting to 3% of GDP, and we want to make sure AUKUS can live alongside an appropriate level of funding of the rest of our military capability. And right now, that is not what's occurring, and it's time for this government to get its act together. Thank you very much. All good. Cheers.
And that is where we will leave that media conference there. Let's bring in political reporter Olivia Casely. And Olivia, you were just listening in there. What do you make of Angus Taylor's comments?
Well, it's fascinating, really, because these are the first comments we're hearing from the opposition after this historic news today. Anthony Albanese standing up in the Prime Minister's courtyard here at Parliament House to announce that Australia will formally recognise Palestinian statehood at a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in New York next month. Now, the Prime Minister made it very clear during his press conference that granting of Palestinian statehood is conditional conditional, and basically Australia would like to see a certain things met. So among them, for example, that there's no future Hamas involvement in any future Palestinian state, and that the group, which Australia has deemed a terrorist organisation, is demilitarised. Ultimately, we know from that press conference that the Prime Minister raised those conditions with the Palestinian Authority last week during a phone call, and he received those guarantees, and he ultimately said that was a very important red line, if you like, or condition or hoop that he needed to be jumped through to get to this point today. We also heard from the Foreign Minister Penny Wong earlier saying that any sort of practical measures, such as creating an embassy in a Palestinian state, would also be predicated upon those factors. Angus Taylor, though, the Shadow Defence Minister, arguing that the Albanese government hasn't got sufficient assurance or concrete evidence to suggest that those preconditions will be met. And he ultimately was saying there that the government's put the cart before the horse. He says he even accused the Albanese government of essentially rewarding terrorism by moving down this pathway, which we've got to say we've seen numerous Western countries around the world taking these steps in recent weeks in order to try and compel the Israeli government to retreat from Gaza as we see the humanitarian crisis deteriorating on the ground. When it comes to this question of Palestinian statehood, the Albanese government's been clear for about a year now. Foreign Minister Penny Wong gave an important speech in which he indicated that this question of Palestinian statehood, it didn't necessarily have to come at the end of a peace process. It could come during that process. And that's in line with the announcement that we've seen from the Albanese government today. The difference here with the opposition is that they'd say that they want to see any recognition given at the end of a peace process once a peace has been achieved. So a clear difference there between the government and the opposition. Ultimately, both believe in a two-state solution but have different views about how to get there. I think what's interesting too, from Angus Taylor's comments, that's a much more hardline position than we've seen even from the likes of Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, who has argued for, some restraint from Israel. He has repeatedly questioned what is Israel's end game here. We've seen Angus Taylor there. He's much more in tune with the Shadow Foreign Minister, Michaelia Cash, who has been a lot more supportive of Israel more generally. So we are seeing these policy tensions play out within the opposition at a time when they're undergoing this kind of a policy audit after their huge defeat at the election polls. As we know, they've looking at a lot of their policies, but it would seem here that there is some shifts, especially in this question here. Ultimately, I think there is a sense among the international community that this crisis has gone on too long, and that's why we're seeing the Albanese government join countries such as the UK, France and Canada today.
Olivia Casely, thanks for that analysis. Let's recap this breaking news now. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has announced that Australia will recognise the state of Palestine at the United Nations General Assembly next month. However, there is a condition that terror group Hamas play no role in the future governance of Palestine. The decision follows moves by the UK, France and Canada to also recognise a Palestinian state at the UN meeting. Anthony Albanese says the federal government is making the statement as part of a coordinated global effort building momentum for a two-state solution. The Prime Minister says he discussed the matter with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last Thursday. Anthony Albanese says he told him there needed to be a political solution, not a military response. The Prime Minister says today's announcement is about building momentum towards peace in the Middle East.
This is not Australia acting alone. What we are seeing is a range of countries engaging in detailed dialogue as well, behind the scenes, if you like, talking about what a peace looks like in the region, and it's something that had an impact on the world. This conflict, which has gone on for such a long period of time, I think Australians want to see an end to it. And an end to it can only be secured when both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security.
That is the Prime Minister speaking just a little over an hour ago. Former Middle East correspondent Nicole Johnson is with me now. She also lived in Gaza in 2011. You know the politics of the area, you know the geography of the area intimately. What is the significance, in your opinion, of today's announcement from the Australian Prime Minister?
Well, certainly the significance is part of the broader momentum that we've got building. And I think anyone who's been watching this story for the last few weeks won't be surprised. The Prime Minister had said it was a matter of when, not if. Well, now is the when. So we're going to see this recognition in September. But Australia's a small player in all of this, and the Prime Minister has said that time and time again. He's almost used it as an excuse up until now not to push towards recognition. But the pressure was building. We had France doing it, Canada doing it, the UK. Australia was clearly coordinating with all of these countries. I think possibly the next one to keep an eye on would be Japan. We heard the Prime Minister say that he had spoken to Japan's leader. So there is a global sort of consensus that more needs to be done, that a red line has been crossed, and that enough is enough. But at the same time, this is symbolic. It's not going to change anything for people in Gaza tomorrow on the ground, but it's certainly a sign that the rhetoric is changing, that there is a shift in the public mood and opinion towards Israel. This has been going on for a long time, but right now it seems as though the world is sort of quite fed up with all of it.
You've lived in Gaza, as we've spoken just earlier. What are the people in Gaza likely to think about Australia's announcement? Does it matter to them?
Look, first of all, I would say people in Gaza are focused on one thing, and that is trying to get food. And as much as we like to sit here in Australia and think people in Gaza are watching what we're doing and thinking and feeling more hopeful and all of this, I think the bottom line is they're waking up every day trying to work out how they'll get food to their family. That is the reality in Gaza. Having said that, when we had the big protest over the Harbour Bridge, I did have messages from some of my old colleagues and some friends there, and they were quite stunned to see it. They said, you know, that is amazing that we've seen that in Australia, tens of thousands of people. And so in that respect, I think it makes them realise that the world hasn't entirely forgotten them. But at the same time, on the ground, nothing is changing. You know, very little food is getting in. Israel says there are more trucks, there are aid drops. We know that this is a drop in the ocean. So I think for Palestinians, this is all part of the diplomatic manoeuvring that's going on the side, when all they want is a ceasefire and an end to the war. And no one's talking about a ceasefire. That's all fallen apart. You know, we had those discussions underway in Qatar time and time again. They fell apart. The Israelis blamed Hamas. Hamas blamed the Israelis. So we can have all of the recognition that we like, but no one is talking about ending the war right now.
What is your assessment of the commitments that the Prime Minister said that he had received from President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority?
It's an interesting one. I mean, of course they want a demilitarised state. Well, that's also going to require Hamas to hand in its arms. Right now, I don't see Hamas in any position where it's going to hand over its weapons. Obviously, Hamas can't be a part of it. I think it also involves international forces on the ground in Gaza. That is something that the Israelis have spoken about as well. It's a vague plan. We don't know what it is. Israel's calling for some sort of Arab force in Gaza. What is that? Can any of us really imagine Arab countries putting their own troops on the ground to police Palestinians in Gaza? I don't see it. None of the Arab countries have come out and said that they support it, so I don't know what that's all about. They also want to have elections. Well, elections in Gaza and the West Bank at some stage in the not too distant future or the future. How does that happen? Elections can only happen with an agreement by the State of Israel. Because let's not forget, Gaza and the West Bank are occupied by Israel. Israel controls everything. So none of these practical conditions or preconditions from various countries can really happen unless Israel is on board. And they've made it very clear that this is shameful. Australia's being led down a rabbit hole along with the European countries. So I think it's difficult at this stage to see the path through all of this, recognition or no recognition.
How important and critical is the Arab League in this? And if you can remind our viewers what they have said to date.
That's a really good point, Kath, and both the Prime Minister and Penny Wong spoke about it a number of times in the press conference, how significant it had been for the Arab League to come out and say that a future Palestinian state could not involve Hamas. And the reason that is significant is because of those sort of dozen Arab countries, some of them do support Hamas and have over the years. Countries like Qatar. Now, other countries, Qatar and Egypt under the previous government. Saudi Arabia, for example, adamantly opposed to Hamas. So there's been a real division over the years inside the Arab League about the issue of Hamas and political Islam. Hamas was formed as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, enemy number one for the state of Egypt. But now they're all on board. Hamas certainly appears to be on the outer, and this is a big deal, especially for Qatar, because it is hosting the political leadership of Hamas. You know, the big league of Hamas is living their best lives in villas in Doha, supported by the state of Qatar. Well, now they're saying that there will be no future role at all for Hamas in any future Palestinian state. So Hamas certainly doesn't seem to have the support that it once had politically. But, I mean, what does this all mean in the middle of a war? People are still being killed. We had 5 Al Jazeera journalists, including their driver, killed today. Most days we're hearing reports of 50 to 100 people killed in Gaza. And I think while we sit here and get very excited about this news of potential recognition by various countries, including Australia, we have to take a pause and just remember what's happening in Gaza. And for now, none of this is making any difference to the issue of starvation, or as the UN hunger body says, on the brink of famine. So perhaps the real focus and the real pressure should be on trying to get trucks and aid into Gaza. And who has the power to do that? It is Israel, the occupying country that controls the borders. So recognition is one way to do it, and that's the path that Australia is going down, so it seems. But there needs to be just a stronger focus on trying to get food to people.
Yeah, I guess the discussion that we've been having today is that there are fewer international levers to be pulled that expectations that countries feel as though that they have. There is discussion about the US and where it goes from here. Can a Palestinian statehood have any meaning without the US?
Well, no, because the US, for starters, can veto it anyway. I mean, we already have 140 countries, more than 140, that recognise Palestine and have done for years. The reason these countries are getting so much attention, France, Canada and the UK, is they are G7, they are big countries, important countries, major allies of Israel, and that indicates that there is this significant shift underway. The other really interesting country is Germany. Germany on the weekend announcing that it would no longer send arms to Israel. I mean, Germany has been one of the staunchest supporters and advocates, of course, of the State of Israel because of the historical position of the Holocaust. So I thought that was really significant that they had come out and said that. But yeah, I mean, the big picture for Australia is this doesn't immediately change anything, but it is part of the bigger picture of what is going on.
Coalition with all of this. I want to ask you about the pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, because earlier the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the push for a Palestinian state as an, and I'll quote, absurdity, and says it won't change Israel's position.
The prevailing assumption in this is that the problem that we have with the Palestinians is the absence of a Palestinian state. And if they were given a Palestinian state, they would stop the efforts to destroy the Jewish state. But the Palestinians were offered a state many times, including in the partition resolution, and they turned it down. It defies imagination or understanding how intelligent people around the world, including seasoned diplomats, government leaders, and respected journalists fall for this absurdity. It's so easy to verify. And today, most of the Jewish public is against the Palestinian state for the simple reason that they know it won't bring peace, it'll bring war. To have European countries and Australia march into that, rabbit hole, just like that, fall right into it, and buy this canard is disappointing, and I think it's actually shameful. But it's not going to change our position.
And these were comments made ahead of the formal announcement. But as the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said, he had conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to be digging his heels in, emboldened by this chorus of countries that are joining the calls for Palestinian statehood.
That's right, but of course he's also talking tough, and we wouldn't expect anything else from Netanyahu. He's talking tough to the international audience and to his domestic audience. He's not going to show any backroom pressure. I mean, this is all part of the persona and everything that he has to be doing right now. So I don't think we should be surprised that he seems to be digging in his heels or doubling down. What else would we expect him to say? And these responses, it's exactly what he has said for other countries, such as Spain, Norway, Ireland. They all announced recognition last year, and he had a similar thing to say. But again, what is significant is how large these countries are, how important they are, and especially in the case of France and the UK, because these are the traditional countries, after all, that divided the Middle East back in the day as part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So they have the sort of historical footprint in the region. But will we see any change from Netanyahu? I don't think so. I think the war will continue, and he's clearly focused on maintaining his own domestic position. He's concerned about his right-wing cabinet. As far as they're concerned, they want the war to go on. They want to annex land. They want to extend the settlements in the West Bank. All of these points were made very strongly by Penny Wong. They were certainly emphasising that this sense that if Australia and other countries don't do something now, then it could slip through their fingers, and Australia could, in the eyes of this government and the critics of the Israeli state, end up on the wrong side of history if they don't join the rest of the international community in recognising a state of Palestine.
Because when you look at the domestic politics for Benjamin Netanyahu, he's on a tightrope here, and it's becoming more precarious for him as his cabinet becomes divided, as does his country.
Well, exactly, and especially the country and especially the military. I mean, this has been building up for a couple of months. I was in Jerusalem in April, and we were interviewing former Israeli Air Force commanders. Now, these are the upper echelon. This is the elite of the Israeli Defence Forces, and they wanted an end to the war. They were speaking out against Netanyahu. I spoke to somebody this morning who had spent 200 days serving inside Gaza as a reservist doctor, going in with the troops. He said Netanyahu, in his opinion, is only concerned about one thing, that is political survival, that he is not interested in the fate of the hostages, and that the country wants this war to end.
So how do you see this playing out? There's obviously a month between now and September. Do you expect that there will be other countries joining the calls for Palestinian statehood recognition?
I certainly got that impression from what we heard from the Prime Minister. He had said he'd spoken to a number of countries, including Japan, so we could see more G7 countries get on board. I think it would be a real stretch for Germany to do it. Japan might do it. We've heard from New Zealand this morning. They're thinking about it. So we are seeing a sort of growing crescendo of this. But as I said, it hasn't happened in isolation. Ireland, and Spain, Norway had all done this last year, and there will be those who say, well, it is about time that the rest of the world started to wake up and see what's happening in Gaza and make moves to put pressure on Netanyahu. Clearly, from Israel's perspective, though, this is all shameful. This will achieve nothing, and as far as they're concerned, Australia and these various other European countries, they are the ones on the wrong side of history.
Nicole Johnson, we'll leave it there for now, but thank you. Let's go to more domestic political reaction now, and Isabel Rowe is standing by in Parliament House for us. Good afternoon, Isabel. I believe that we've just heard from the opposition leader, Susan Lee.
We have. We heard earlier from Angus Taylor, of course, but the opposition leader, Susan Lee, has now put out a statement along with Michaelia Cash, and it says that the coalition has serious concerns about the Albanese government's decision here to unilaterally recognise a Palestinian state. It says the decision at this time puts Australia with odds at odds with the United States of America, our most important ally, and that the US has an essential role to play in brokering a viable peace deal here. She also talks in this statement about a lack of a bipartisan position on this policy now. It says, until today, it has been a bipartisan position that the question of recognising a Palestinian state should come at the end of a peace negotiation progress, and that it was, until today, a bipartisan position that there should be no recognition of a Palestinian state with Hamas still in control of Gaza. The statement is quite lengthy, but it goes on to raise some of the same concerns that Angus Taylor we heard raise earlier, that there is not enough guarantee in the mind of the opposition that Hamas is able to be removed from a future Palestinian state.
Isabel Rowe, thank you. Dr. Ayal Mayroz is a senior lecturer on human rights and international peace and security in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. He's also a former counter-terrorism analyst in Israel's Defence Forces, and he joins me now from Sydney. Ayal, thank you very much for your time. What do you make of the announcement and its timing from Australia?
Well, nothing surprising there. I think that was to be expected of the government. I think Albanese is right in terms of the building momentum side, not so much maybe about the more urgent and direct influences on the situation on the ground. But who's to say that we only need to focus on the direct ones? The question, I think, is whether these countries that are now calling for or saying they will support the creation of a Palestinian state will leave it at that, kicking the can down the road, even though an important kick for a month now, or will they also take other measures that are more significant for the dire situation now on the ground in Gaza?
What other measures would they be?
Well, I think, again, a strong influence on the US, cost-benefit analysis on Trump, because the only one that at the moment can influence Netanyahu and Netanyahu's political survival calculations are the Americans, is Trump. And so very strong pressure, unity of pressure on Trump. I think there is a role to play for what we call middle powers, that for a long time, a lot of middle powers, such as Australia, have neglected their role in international relations to influence the major powers. And I think such a strong influence on Trump could potentially lead to a stronger influence by Trump on the Israelis. And that is the only thing at the moment that could influence the ceasefire and the resumption of serious negotiations.
Ayal, what do you think the view from within Israel would be in response to Australia's announcement today?
I think this is a problematic issue because the recognition of a Palestinian state is years late. It should have come a long time ago. I'm not convinced that this is the right time in the immediate future, because indeed that has stalled the latest round of negotiations by giving Hamas the impression that time is playing in their favor. And so the only way to counter that is for these countries, for the middle powers, as well as for the Americans, to create a scenario, an alternative scenario that will allay a lot of Israelis' fear that should a Palestinian state be created, shortly after it will be democratically be changed, the regime will change to Hamas, and therefore the risks to Israelis will become manifold. So if the international community is serious, they should create the structure and the support that the Palestinian Authority, which is not, as the previous speaker said, is not popular at all within among the Palestinians, that will change, that will reform significantly, and that will have the power and the ability and the resources to offer the Palestinians what they want and need, so that they will not vote in the future Hamas into any kind of position of power, and therefore allay the Israelis' fear of a Hamas-led Palestinian state next door.
So where do you see, Yael, this leaving any potential ceasefire or return of hostages?
That's the question. Again, that goes back to the Americans. If the Americans want, I think they have the power to force Netanyahu's hand. As the previous speaker said, also, most Israelis are against continuation of the war. They care mostly about the hostages. They don't want their soldiers in Gaza, and they don't see any future of that. So this kind of multi-pronged pressure on Israel, on the Americans, can be the only thing that I think can lead in the immediate future into a reprieve. Israel is already trying to release some of that pressure by at least a little bit of more humanitarian aid and other ways, but more needs to be done for Israel to be quicker and to be more or to succumb more to this kind of pressure.
We know that today's announcement from the Prime Minister rests with a number of conditions or commitments, if you like, that he says he spoke to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority about. We know that in order for those conditions or commitments to be met, it relies on a strong Palestinian Authority. To what extent should Australia play in rebuilding and supporting the Palestinian Authority?
Again, this is 2 years too late. The discussions on so-called day after solutions should have started and meaningfully started soon after the 7th of October. They didn't, and the international community wasn't strong enough. Australia is not a major player, but Australia, along and together with the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the British, the French, and so on, and maybe even the German and the Italians, can make a difference. And so I mean, the collective security for which the UN was created is just that, the collective effort by states to maintain or restore international peace and security.
You're a former counterterrorism analyst with the Israel Defence Forces, a retired captain. What does this mean on the impact of war in the region, if any?
I think if you're talking about what is happening in Gaza, then as again previous speaker said, most people in Israel, most former high generals and other high officials in the security services say that there is no benefit whatsoever for any kind of Israeli continuation of the war in Gaza for some say over a year now, and that includes the Israeli chief of staff. So I think inside Gaza there's no point to continue, and everybody knows that. The problem is that the Netanyahu government was democratically elected, and it's very difficult to change government now because of the support of radical elements, Jewish religious parties for Netanyahu based on their calculations. In terms of regional, I don't see any kind of escalation beyond what is taking place in Gaza at the moment.
Dr. Yael Mehrous, Senior Lecturer on Human Rights and International Peace and Security in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, recognising the state of Palestine sends a strong political message, but it also comes with legal ramifications. Here to talk us through them is Damien Carrick, who presents the Law Report for ABC Radio National. And Damien, if Australia and other Western countries recognise Palestine in September at the UN, will that mean that Palestine will move closer to being a fully recognised state in the UN?
Hi, Kath. Look, it might help it shift a little bit closer to that goal, but the votes of a few extra countries will not push it across the line and make it a full member of the United Nations. Currently, 147 out of 193 member states of the United Nations recognise Palestine as a state. They recognise the Palestinian Authority as a representative of that state. But it only has status as a non-member observer. And that's because even though a great majority of the General Assembly accept states who are members of the General Assembly accept Palestine as a full state, to become a full member of the United Nations, you still need to get the green light from the 15-member Security Council. And on that 15-member Security Council, you've got 5 members, permanent members, the victors from World War II, China, France, the UK, Russia and the USA, and they all have a veto. And the USA exercises that veto every time the General Assembly says, look, we want Palestine to become a full member state. And as recently as last year, that happened. Went to the Security Council, and the USA vetoed it. I think Switzerland and maybe the UK abstained, but for that reason, it didn't get across the line. And so if Canada, the UK, France, Australia, and maybe a number of other countries, who knows, recognise Palestine in September, that equation won't change.
It's something that I've been discussing with our guests this afternoon, those veto powers that those strong and powerful countries hold. Damien, what are the political, or rather symbolic, advantages of the recognition of statehood, either by the UN or by individual countries?
Well, nothing changes on the ground immediately. I suppose it allows a state to enter into treaty negotiations with other states as equals, but of course, you know, what real power does the Palestinian Authority have? You know, it is, as it's been described, a diminished entity. But symbolically, it sends a very, very important message about what a country's position is on Palestinian self-determination, and whether that be countries like the Western democracies, which are shifting in the last few weeks, or the General Assembly. It does send an important message. And I suppose from Australia's perspective, that is centred, or that shift is it comes at a time when there's enormous concern about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Damien, we heard our International Affairs editor Laura Tingle say that the government has looked for commitments from the Palestinian Authority rather than place conditions on it. What is the legal difference there, and how is it different from the UK and Canada?
Well, I guess there's a political question about what conditions are being placed on it by the Australian government, and it's very interesting to hear that analysis before, that the PM has sought commitments from the Palestinian Authority, and there are many, but they include it holding elections, Hamas having no role in government, Palestine being demilitarised, and the Palestinian Authority accepting that. Now, what's really interesting is that where that fits in what some of our other equivalent kind of countries, what their positions are, and it seems that we're kind of more in line with the Canadian position. The UK seems to be saying it will recognise Palestine unless Israel does something, which is have a ceasefire. So we seem to be going more along the lines of the Canadians, from what we know at the moment, than from the UK. So there are different conditions being placed on different people. Conditions and commitments, and I guess they're slightly different. So we're in a very interesting place politically, and how that will transpose into the legal situation, what remains to be seen.
Damien Carrick, thank you very much for your analysis.
Cheers.
Returning now to the Prime Minister's announcement and the government's reasoning for the decision to formally recognise Palestinian statehood. He says the Israeli government continues to defy international law, and that the move is about delivering a lifeline to the people of Gaza.
I've said it publicly, and I said it directly to President Netanyahu, to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The situation in Gaza has gone beyond the world's worst fears. Far too many innocent lives have been lost. The Israeli government continues to defy international law and deny sufficient aid, food and water to desperate people, including children. This vital aid must be allowed to get to the people who need it most. This is about much more than drawing a line on a map. This is about delivering a lifeline to the people of Gaza. I understand that on this issue, history casts a long shadow. Every generation has known failures and false dawns. Yet the story of this struggle is also one of opportunities not taken. That is where the risk of trying is nothing compared to the danger of letting this moment pass us by. The toll of the status quo is growing by the day, and it can be measured in innocent lives. The world cannot wait for success to be guaranteed. That only means waiting for a day that will never come. There is a moment of opportunity here, and Australia will work with the international community to seize it.
Well, the state of Palestine's delegation to Australia and New Zealand has welcomed the decision to recognise Palestine from the government. It says, and I'll read their quotes here, Australia's recognition of the state of Palestine marks a significant and historic step towards achieving justice, peace and the long overdue realisation of the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and sovereign independent statehood. This decision affirms Australia's commitment to international law, the international rules-based order and to a political solution in accordance with the two-state solution and relevant resolutions. New Zealand could join Australia in recognising Palestinian statehood when the country's cabinet meets next month. The Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, said in a statement, ultimately, New Zealand has an independent foreign policy and on this issue, we intend to weigh up the issue carefully and then act accordingly to New Zealand's principles, values and national interest. New Zealand has been clear for some time that the recognition of a Palestinian state is a matter of when, not if. Well, let's go live now to Melbourne and bring in host of Afternoon Briefing, Patricia Karvelis. Hi, PK. I mean, the rumours had been gathering at pace for the last few weeks, and particularly this morning about when, not if, that Australia would make an announcement. Has it played out as you would have expected with respect to the announcement as well as the reactions?
I think it's been quite clear over the last week, especially after Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, spoke last week and made a statement which was, I think, really clear, crystal clear if you look now with the fullness of time at what's happened, where she talked about if we don't recognise soon, so she talked about a sense of urgency, and she changed the metrics for Australia to move to recognising a Palestinian state to one of urgency. So previously, the government has shifted on this quite significantly in the last couple of weeks. It had talked about conditions being met. The Prime Minister had even told our colleague David Spears that it shouldn't just be about gestures. So the language the government started using really dramatically shifted last week to one of urgency, to one of if we don't recognise a Palestinian state soon, there will be no Palestine to recognise. And then, Kath, I can kind of give you a bit of insight because I've spoken to lots of key figures now as I've been trying to work the phones in between all of my jobs here. What shifted really was in the last week the Prime Minister started telling his colleagues that, you know, he'd spent his whole life wanting to recognise Palestinian statehood, so this was going to happen. And so he'd really told many people, and I think that's why we've been hearing more and more that this was imminent. Clearly, the entrenched view in the cabinet, so there were some in the cabinet who had been sort of putting up a bit of resistance to this happening in a speedy way. No, they weren't against it full stop, but the speed, and that was shifting as well. So there's a few reasons for that. One of them is international momentum around this and the coordination that we've been talking about for several weeks. So France first, the UK, Canada, now even New Zealand. Let's not underestimate the New Zealand statement. They have not recognised Palestinian statehood today, but they've talked about that they're actively considering it. That's what Australia did several weeks ago. That's the precursor to then recognition. So the whole sort of Western world that had been holding off has now moved to this position. And so then the other key moment, I think, was last Friday where the Netanyahu security cabinet had met in that marathon meeting and made a decision to essentially occupy Gaza City, and that was a further escalation and again met the metric that Penny Wong had stipulated, which was about there won't be any Palestine to recognise. So all of those ducks lined up, and the Albanese government with the Prime Minister that, don't forget, has been a fierce proponent of a Palestinian state his entire political life, going back to his university days, was in a position that now is the right time. And now it's happened. I mean, that phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu, clearly the Prime Minister made it clear to the Netanyahu government that this is what Australia was going to do. I don't think he gave him the date of announcement, but there certainly was a conversation around that. And so in the Prime Minister and his Cabinet's estimation, all of the conditions were right now for Australia to be the next country to make this announcement as we move towards this September sitting of the UN General Assembly.
And PK, what do you make of the reaction to the announcement so far?
Well, all of the reaction has been rather predictable. So all of the people who have wanted the government to take action on Palestinian recognition have applauded it, some wanting them to go further, and I'll get back to that because watch that space. This won't be the end of calls for more action from the Albanese government. This doesn't end the issue of activism and advocacy around Gaza and Palestinian rights in our country. I think there will be more. So that's to be expected. I think you'll see a lot of unity in the Albanese government from the backbench right up. I don't think there's going to be much disagreement that this is the right move. We've seen people, prominent people like Bob Carr, who of course was Foreign Minister in Australia in the Gillard government, who's been pushing very hard for Australia to follow, even after France made the announcement saying Australia should be next. He's welcomed the decision. So all of that, pretty predictable. Then I think that some of the pro-Israel groups, some of the Jewish groups have been very concerned about this. Now, this is not shocking at all. They have been saying this for several weeks, that they think recognition now would be rewarding Hamas. That is their view, and they have articulated that again today. And then there's the opposition. Now, the opposition under the leadership of Susan Lee, who have come out and said that they are very concerned about this announcement. There is not bipartisanship on this announcement. The one thing there is still bipartisanship on, which, Kath, I think should be said, is that both sides of politics believe in a two-state solution. It's just about how you get to that outcome. So the opposition does not think that the Albanese government is following this in the right order. They think that this is too hasty, that it's a sort of dangerous pace that the government has moved in. But I suppose in terms of the Albanese government's positioning, they've acted after the UK, after France, after Canada. These are not sort of radical out there countries, and we have not been first to go. And I think this has been consistent with the Albanese style, to wait till there is a chorus, a momentum, and then to make the call. So even if the opposition is to be critical, as they have been, I don't think we've seen the Albanese government go rogue here. They have clearly been working with the international community making this announcement. And so I don't know how much weight that criticism will carry, given, I think, that broader context, the international context here.
And just finally, PK, ending on that note, the international context, I've been speaking to experts throughout the afternoon who say that meaningful statehood is really only an option with the United States, and that it's up now to the international community to pressure the United States. But just how realistic is that?
That's a great question, and it's the key question. So until Donald Trump and his administration move to put more pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu over this question of the Gaza expansion, over this question of statehood, I think it's a fair criticism to say that it will not happen. But equally, I can tell you what our government's thinking has been and the conversations around the cabinet table. I mean, I don't get invited to cabinet, but I try to find out as much as I can the spirit of those conversations. And the view has been that Australia is working with this other kind of axis of power and getting on with the work in the absence of, and someone put this very clearly to me, in the absence of leadership from the United States in this space. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. Is that working? Well, clearly not yet. Benjamin Netanyahu relies on the patronage and support of the US and of Donald Trump. So that's key to him and his own political survival. Let's not forget how much pressure he's under. There have been huge protests in Israel that we have seen. There are huge concerns in Israel about the continuation of this war. So we're not going to see anything dramatically shift, I think, in terms of a two-state solution. But I think big countries like France and the UK and us, middle powers, putting their words and their actions on the record at these international forums does carry weight, does carry moral pressure, and will have ultimately some impact on the United States, perhaps over a longer period of time. But that's the way public opinion shifting works. I mean, the Albanese government a year ago raised the issue of Palestinian statehood, but hasn't been ready to take this action for a year. It does take a while to kind of build that kind of momentum. And some of that is also happening in the United States. Public opinion has shifted there. That's the reason I think we saw Donald Trump refer to the starvation in Gaza. There was public pressure, even on his MAGA side, so even on the right flank, to call out what was happening on the ground in Gaza. So no shift yet from the United States. You are right, and so are all the experts, that without that, meaningful change for the Palestinian people will not happen. But I think the rest of the Western countries, including our own, have made the determination that we cannot just wait for the United States to take action, that there needs to be advocacy and action from the other nations, and that's why they've been working together.
PK, thank you very much. It'll be an interesting afternoon briefing today. Thank you.